pitch to the Twilight Zone to potential sponsors.
How do you do? You gentlemen, of course, know how to push a product. That essentially is your job. My presence here is for much the same purpose, simply to push a product. To acquaint you with an entertainment product which we hope and which we rather expect will make your product pushing that much easier. What you're about to see, gentlemen, is a series called The Twilight Zone. We think it's a rather special kind of series. Essentially, people watch television to get entertained. And the keynote of this series, the thing we're concerned with, the thing we're aiming for, the thing we're working toward is entertainment. This is a series for the storyteller, because it's our thinking that an audience will always sit still and listen and watch a well-told story. And now that I've immodestly gone on record predicting the high quality of this series, let me very briefly show you what we mean by a special kind of series. You know, writers in general are notoriously bad verbal tellers of stories. We do much, much better behind a typewriter. So I hope you'll bear with me while I tell you about a few stories that happen to be the first ones we're shooting in our current production cycle. This is sand. It represents desert. The desert that you'll see on your screen in a story we call The Lonely. The Lonely is about a man sentenced to a lifetime of solitary confinement.
Isn't it amazing that a show that just wound up and I say just, Rod Serling is like one of the most amazing television writers of all time in terms of longevity of the stories that he wanted to tell. But, like, isn't it amazing that this little, like, genre fiction show that, of course, had moral messages to teach, and it was allegory for social issues, and it had a lot of important things to say, but at the end of the day, The Twilight Zone is a genre fiction show that usually deals in either horror, fantasy, or science fiction, and it's, like, one of the longest-lasting, culturally important television shows of all time. That's so cool.
The confinement takes place on a sandy asteroid far out
Leon
in space.
Morgan, thanks for following.
It's a story about a man slowly succumbing to...
I don't know if you... I saw a pretty good interview with Rod Serling from... I don't remember what universities he was at, but it was after The Twilight Zone. It was in, like, the 70s, I want to say, where he did the interview. And he's, like, an incredibly progressive guy. It was really, really interesting. Check it out if you have the chance. Just look up, like, Rod Serling college interview, and I'm sure it'll come up.
To a kind of nightmarish loneliness.
He was talking about, like, justice in terms of, like, racial issues for the country at the time. He was talking about political systems and how I think Nixon had just won or something. It was very, very interesting.
A gradual disintegration of mind and body because human beings have that palpable need for companionship. A most benevolent and compassionate official sends the prisoner a long rectangular box containing, well, a machine. A machine inside of a robot built in the form of a woman. It's a robot that talks and acts like a human being. A robot that thinks like a human being.
I do find it funny that they say robot like that. That is good. And within the episode, they also call it a robot. I remember that episode.
Gentlemen, I can...
The funny thing is, and this is something that I think is interesting to think about. The moral of that episode, which is, like Rod Serling says, the episode's called The Lonely, and it's about a prisoner who's, like, on a prison colony, but it's a prison colony of one. It's like a solitary confinement thing where they put him on an asteroid in the middle of an asteroid belt somewhere, and he's just there alone. They bring him this android, this human woman robot, and it seemingly has a personality, and they fall in love, and such and such. And if that were made today, it would be something like the movie Her, where, of course, it's, like, validated that other being, even though it's not really human, it is a being in and of itself worthy of its own rights and its own, you know, respect as a living consciousness. Because we've, I think, progressed in a lot of ways in society where we recognize, like, something is not only sentient, but sapient, it should have the same rights as us. But the moral at the end of that episode, The Twilight Zone from the 60s, is like, oh, it's just a robot. never mind. Like, that's the moral at the end of that episode, is the face gets broken apart and he sees the inside mechanisms of the robot and he's like, oh, I guess I don't love her because she's just a robot. So that's one of the few Twilight Zone episodes that I don't think holds up very well to modern scrutiny, but most of them do.
Only tell you that The Lonely, which involves a man and a woman made out of plastic and wires with a machine for a heart, will provide a most bizarre experience. As to the physiological extensions of their relationship, that is, man and female machine, and what they do in their spare time, we're leaving this wide open. Object and point here, a file cabinet containing a contract, all very legal and proper, except the party of the first part in this case. Well, what do we call him? He has a lot of names. Beelzebub, Mr. Scratch.
People used to call Satan Mr. Scratch. It's a weird old-timey parlance I've not heard.
The first part in a somewhat charred contract. Only in our story, which we call escape clause.
Have I read the recent Guardian article written by AI? It's literally trying to convince humans that we shouldn't be afraid of it, but it comes across so creepy. No, I haven't. Do you have a link? I'll read it after this.
His name is simply Mr. Cadwallader. As portrayed, he has all the charm of a well-tipped waiter. He makes a deal with a little man who has a psychotic fear of dying. It's really a simple contract.
Oh, escape clause. I remember that episode. It's the guy who... he makes a deal with Satan that he can live forever, and almost immediately he starts doing ridiculous things, and he kills his wife so he can, like, do the electric chair and survive for some reason. He wants to do that. But instead, they give him life imprisonment, and he's like, oh no, I live forever. This prison sentence will never end. So he exercises the escape clause, in which he gets a heart attack and dies, and he presumably goes to hell because he sold his soul to Satan. That one always bothered me, though, because I'm like, what are you talking about? You live forever. You'll outlive this jail. Just, like, wait. You're fine. You'll eventually escape, and even a life sentence doesn't literally mean until you die. It's usually, like, a set, like, 40 to 50 to 60-year life sentence, depending on where you are. I don't know what the laws were in the 60s, but... Dr. Gamble with a bit. His sales pitch is so captivating, and he's just basically saying, here's an idea for a show I have. True. Yeah. Rod Serling's a charismatic guy. He knew how to get an audience, and that's why I think he's so good as the narrator. If you haven't seen the reboot of The Twilight Zone, hosted by Jordan Peele is basically the Rod Serling in the new show. The first season's pretty rough, but the second season came out this year, and it's really good. So go check it out. It's got some good stuff. Like, legit. One of the episodes in this season of the Twilight Zone reboot was so good, it's probably in my top 10 Twilight Zone episodes of all time. It's the one with Topher Grace in it. It's later in the season. It's awesome. It's so good.
Mr. Cadwallader.
But the rest are also pretty entertaining. The problem with the first season, I think, of the Twilight Zone reboot was, firstly, I think they did it pretty quickly. I'm not going to spoil it. I won't spoil what happens in the episode. But in the first season, it feels like they made every single episode be an hour long, and it just didn't work. In season 2, though, it seems like they were like, okay, the episodes are however long they are. If it's 30 minutes, great. If it's 40 minutes, cool. If it's an hour, awesome. But, like, don't feel the need to stretch. There was only truly one really bad episode in the most recent season, and I think it's the finale, unfortunately. It's the one where they bring back the, what are they called? To Serve Man. It's a semi-sequel to Serve Man, this episode of the original Twilight Zone. The most recent season brought them back, and it's the worst episode of the Twilight Zone I've ever seen. It is so bad. So just skip that one. If you're watching the new season of the Twilight Zone, skip this episode. It's not worth watching. It's awful.
The immortality, and the little man supplies his soul. And then our little man proceeds to live it up, or down, depending on the moral view. But he gets bored with immortality, and he then proceeds to live a very out-of-the-ordinary kind of a life. A life best described as simply violent.
crashes and
he
cars.
was so bored with constantly being the only survivor. So he now turns to homicide, happily aware that while a jury may convict him, there isn't a single legal modus operandi that the state can use to put him away. A gas chamber? Impossible. They can't kill him. Hanging, electrocution, none of these things are operative on our little friend. He's immortal. But what happens, and we'd be most appreciative if you wouldn't tell this to your friends, is that a very good lawyer pleads his case and gets him life imprisonment.
MST3K
Poor little
fan,
guy.
what did
Yeah,
you think
he
of
has
Blurry
immortality.
Man, the season
He can
finale
live
of The
forever.
Rival? Did you feel it did
Right here.
Sterling's memory
Behind these
justice?
things.
I thought the episode was okay. It's a little self-indulgent, to be honest. I like the parts where they're talking about, like, hey, like, it's okay to, like, you shouldn't be ashamed of writing genre fiction. You shouldn't be ashamed of writing, like, sci-fi and stuff like that, because really, really profound messages can be conveyed through that medium. But, like, I don't know, the really long, slow chase sequence just felt like it was trying to stretch out to a runtime, and the CGI Rod Serling at the end was so uncanny valley, it made me very uncomfortable. I don't know. I'm not even saying, if Rod Serling could consent to being turned into like a CGI fake version of himself, he's the kind of guy that I think would probably think that's okay. He'd be like, that's cool. And I think he might be okay with it. But the execution of it itself in the show was so bad. He looked so fake. And I was like, But again, season 2's better. Cover him in cement and drop him into the ocean.
We'll hold up on telling
The voice they got for the Rod Serling in that episode was pretty good, though. It's just the visual was off.
you the ending. Just think about it. It'll come to you. Parenthetic note here. On the Twilight Zone, there'll be a variety of stories. And this is a variety that covers not only story type, but time, locale, the nature of the people. For example, this is a Western called Death, Destry, and Mr. Dingle. And this is the principal character.
They actually changed the title of that one to Mr. Wait, did they? I think they changed his name to Mr. Denton and changed it to Mr. Denton on Doomsday.
In the story. It's a Colt 45.
They used the name Dingle later, though, in a different episode.
There's a school
In Mr. Dingle the Strong.
master named
I've seen the Twilight Zone many times.
Dingle who picks up this gun one day, finding it in the schoolyard. Quite accidentally, it goes off on a couple of occasions. First, it hits a rattlesnake between the eyes at 50 yards. Then it knocks the gun out of a desperado's hand. And while it's all quite accidental, the various onlookers make an assumption that Mr. Dingle's a pretty fast gun. And they start to build not only a
It
reputation...
makes me wonder if Rod Serling actually knew someone with the last name Dingle, and he was, like, trying to name a character that, like, intentionally, because he's like, oh, I know, you know what I mean? It's just weird that here the original name for Mr. Denton was Dingle, and then later he went on to use that name in Mr. Dingle the Strong, or whatever. In Dingle the Strong, the episode where aliens come and give a guy super strength. So, weird that that's a name that was bouncing around in his head enough that he did actually use it, even though it got changed in this one.
for this spindly little dude.
Dr. Gamble, I personally, I like the salesman episode where he makes a sales pitch to Death himself. Yes, One for the Angels. It's in season 1. It's early on in the series run.
But also almost a
Might even be like episode 2 or 3. I don't remember. It's been a while since I've looked at the episode listing.
reverent tradition. And as in the classic Western mold, every top gun in and out of the territory converge on the town, ready to invite Mr. Dingle, poor little Mr. Dingle, who really doesn't know how to use a gun, to a showdown. So, Mr. Dingle buys himself a little vial full of liquid. And it's simply out of this world, because it comes with a money-back guarantee, simply that it will make him the fastest gun in the West for 15 seconds. It's this vial he carries into a saloon one night, ready to meet at gunpoint a gentleman called Dirty Dan Destry, a fast gun in his own right. So fast he makes Hugh O'Brien look like Charles Coburn. But when the two men face one another and Mr. Dingle drinks his liquid with the money-back guarantee, he suddenly sees in the hand of his opponent a very familiar vial, identical with his own. I won't tell you the ending except that it's reasonably happy, if unexpected. I hope I haven't done these stories an injustice because they'll be much better told by actors in front of a camera, as you'll soon note in the picture you're about to see. All I can tell you is that we think the Twilight Zone is pretty unique. We think it'll be much talked about, and we think it'll also be enjoyed. We think it's the kind of a show that will put people on the edge of their seats, but only for that 1/2 an hour. We fully expect they'll go to the stores on the following day and buy your products.
Oh, capitalism.
We think it's that kind of a show. So now the ham walks off to allow the real object and point to entertain you. The pilot show of your series. Earl Holliman, James Gregory, starring in Where Is Everybody? So, gentlemen, please sit back and take your first trip.
Where Is Everybody is like prototypical, it was all a dream. Where Is Everybody is the first episode of The Twilight Zone. And I'm sorry, there's spoilers for a... How old is The Twilight Zone now? 60s now for a 60-year-old show, something like that. Anyway, spoilers for the pilot of The Twilight Zone. If you haven't seen The Twilight Zone, it's on Netflix. At least 3 of the seasons are. Season 4 isn't, but it's on CBS All Access, so go check it out. Anyway, the first episode of The Twilight Zone, Where Is Everybody, involves a guy just walking around a city, and he has no memory of who he is, and there's no one else in the city. And you're like, what's going on the whole time? And then the ending is, it turns out the whole time he's been in a little experimental pod for space travel, and they were just testing, like, what happens to someone's mind if they're left in solitary confinement for weeks and weeks at a time. And the whole episode of him, like, being alone in a town and he doesn't remember who he is just a symptom of his, like, mental break. So prototypical, it was all a dream twist in the first episode of The Twilight Zone.
Into the Twilight Zone.
Are the 80s and 2000s Twilight Zone shows any good? I've never heard of them until recently. The 80s one is pretty good. It's not, like, as good as the original Twilight Zone, but there's some really good stuff in there. So yeah, watch the 80s one. The early 2000s one is terrible. It's terrible. It's so bad. I would go as far to say it's so bad it's good. The only episode you really, really should watch from the early 2000s one is they do an episode that's a sequel to, oh gosh, what was the name of the episode with the little boy who has the psychic powers? Why am I blanking? It's one of the most famous ones. Come on. Ah! Okay, I can't remember. Hold on. Twilight Zone. Psychic kid. It's a Good Life. So remember this famous Twilight Zone episode, It's a Good Life, where the kid has psychic powers and he made the entire world disappear? There's a sequel episode in the early 2000s series called It's Still a Good Life, and they got the same actor who played the kid to come back. And it's basically just, hey, what's this town up to, 20 years after the fact? This kid is still in charge of the town, and he now has a child. Yeah, which means exactly what you think it means. And the child starts to develop psychic powers of her own. So it's like, what's going to happen when this guy who was this kid has to deal with someone else with powers of his own when he's never had anyone who's been able to stand up to him before? It's pretty good. That's like the only really good one of the 2000 series. And then there's the current Jordan Peele one, which a lot of the first season's really rough. So, like, if you just want to skip it, I understand. But season 2 is pretty solid, except for the finale. So, anyway.
See what I mean? And this is really nothing compared to the way Instant Sanka will be disappearing off grocery counters come this fall.
Oh. I think Rod had a lot of problems where he really didn't like. If you've seen interviews with him, he really seemed to not like dealing with sponsors. He thought it got in the way of his ability to tell stories that he wanted to tell because sponsors would always be scared of allowing, like, straight-up morality tales and have their product on it. Almost similar to how YouTube is today. You talk about any topic that's even a little controversial, anything political, and all of a sudden your ads are limited because advertisers get scared of being on something with a message. But weirdly, this limitation created one of the greatest TV shows of all time, because that limitation made Rod say to himself, how do I tell these morality tales in a way that the sponsors won't immediately recognize what they are? And he did so through allegory in the Twilight Zone. So, interestingly, even though I think the strictures that the advertisers put on him were stupid and unnecessary, nonetheless, it did help create one of the greatest TV shows of all time, and sometimes interesting things like that happen. So, what do I think about Night of the Meek? Oh, I love it. It's one of my favorite Christmas episodes of a TV show ever. The only thing is that's one of the Twilight Zone episodes that they didn't shoot on film. They shot it on some other kind of thing. It was like a videotape, not VHS or beta like we got later on, but it was like some kind of tape that wasn't film, and it looks terrible. It's really sad because it's such a good episode of The Twilight Zone. I think it's one of the best, but it's just one of those ones where they had to cheap out and film it on less than stellar equipment, but it still holds up. Night of the Meek is real, real good. I watch that around Christmas time every year. Anyway,